You won't see 50 people in a control room for one launch. You won't see a control room with even 5 people, hopefully. And if there's 5 people, maybe they're controlling 50 different assets that are very complex and a couple hundred assets that are mostly operating on their own.
Welcome to the 5-Year Frontier podcast, a preview of the future through the eyes of the innovators shaping our world. Through short, insight-packed discussions, I seek to bring you a glimpse of what a key industry could look like 5 years out. I'm your host, Daniel Darling, a venture capitalist at Focal, where I spend my days with founders at the very start of their journey to transform an industry. The best have a distinct vision of what's to come, a guiding North Star they're building towards, and that's what I'm here to share with you. In today's episode, we're talking about the future of space operations. In it, we discuss how software is making launch safe, AI co-pilots for complex workflows, predictive simulations, El Segundo and new deep tech hubs, as well as upcoming interstellar missions. Guiding us will be Laura Crabtree, CEO of Epsilon 3, a software platform to manage and orchestrate engineering, testing, and operations for the space industry and other complex industries. Backed by frontier investors Lux Capital and Village Global, Epsilon serves NASA, Virgin Galactic, and the likes of the United States Space Force. Their software is embedded throughout the organization and seeks to drive operational excellence amongst the complex chaos. Laura spent a decade within Spacex as a senior missions operations engineer, as well as 5 years as Northrop Grumman as a systems controller, providing us a unique perspective of the 2 generations of space companies. Hi, Laura. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
This new generation of private space companies like Spacex, where you spent 10 years, has really reawakened the space industry from a kind of slumber. And you see launch costs plummeting, you see talent arriving in droves to the industry. And from the outside, it just looks so inspirational. What does it look like from the inside, from an insider's perspective? And have we reached this kind of like tipping point in our ability to access and develop space?
From an insider, I think that it's changing every day. With the start of SpaceX over 20 years ago, that was the start of all of this because most of us joined SpaceX because we were frustrated with the status quo. You know, a long time ago when I joined this industry, I was told you can get 2 of 3 things. You can get faster, better, or cheaper, and you can only get 2. And all of us that joined SpaceX, we wanted to challenge that paradigm. You know, we wanted to be faster. We also wanted to be better, and we wanted to come in at a lower cost. And so that's kind of what you're seeing is the shift in what is possible and how much it costs to be able to do things. The cost of overhead, the cost of a government contract, the cost of just doing business in space, and just rethinking that. It's been pretty amazing to be a part of. Even right now with SpaceX being as successful as it is, access to space is not easy. It's not super cost effective. And so I think what you're going to see is as prices continue to go down for access to space, you'll see more companies coming up with new ideas of how to utilize space and how to give people things on the ground that they couldn't have even thought about beforehand. So I think we're getting to that point. And I think it all tips on access.
Access meaning the launch costs and how simple and quick it is to get something, a payload up into space.
I think it is launch costs, but I think it's also in manufacturing. It's also in how complex systems have to be to get there, how complex a company has to develop their software to be able to operate in space. So it's access to something standardized to get you on the payload, something standardized to operate the payload, and then an easy standardized way to get to space. So it's kind of all of those things wrapped in one.
Is the trajectory pointing towards the private sector completely taking over the space industry and bringing this infrastructure, this standardization and this innovation? Or is the government and sort of the public sector still a key player?
I think the government will and always will be a key player in space, mostly because space as an asset and as an operational asset needs to be in part run by the government for information and for protection of countries and troops and so on and so forth. But I don't know that the government is going to be developing the hardware and building innovatively. I think that is more or less in the private sector, but the government is going to be a buyer and an operator. And we need the government to, take a stance and to continue to help this space, literal space, evolve in the right way. Take, for instance, what happened with the NASA SpaceX contract. I mean, everybody knows what happened there, but in the past, prior to that, NASA had provided all the launch vehicles, did all of the operations for the shuttle, all of the Apollo missions, but then decided after decommissioning the shuttle to see if private space companies could make this a possibility for the future. And the transition to the private sector to rely on companies like SpaceX and Boeing for launch of future astronauts, I think was a move in the right direction. And I think you'll see kind of the rest of the industry going in that direction too, as private companies are able to do more than they ever were able to do prior to this.
Absolutely. And it kind of feels like maybe the aerospace industry where you have some regulation, you have some infrastructure from the government, some support, but really it's the private sector that moves it forwards and operates it from that, which sounds really exciting. You talk about standardization and really it feels like such a complex backdrop that you've taken on this very brave task of bringing what feels like chaos internally and organizing that and making that really efficient to these space companies. You founded Epsilon 3 4 years ago as a software company to make internal operations really run smoothly and optimize them. Can you walk us through the types of problems that Epsilon solves?
My background for 20 years has been in space operations. So both at Northrop and then at SpaceX. And so I had a lot of exposure to what was being done in operations in lots of different pieces of the industry, launch, spacecraft operations, and rendezvous operations, to name a few. What I wanted to be able to do as I gained more and more experience in the industry was to be able to bring best practices to how we build, test, and operate our vehicles in the future, and really trying to take all of the work that's being done that's easy, repeatable, doesn't take a lot of extra brain power, and is kind of minutia if you look at it in sort of different terms, and standardize it, make it simpler, and make those workflows really as fast as possible so that you're not spending time editing documents, looking at red lines and copying and pasting red lines. So if you look at what people are doing on Epsilon 3, it's integration. So building their vehicle, test. So after you build it, testing the vehicle, testing it lots of different times before you actually put it on a launch vehicle, and then operations. And then in between, obviously, test and operations, you have training and more testing because that's what you have to do. Because once you get to space, you can't touch the vehicle. So the ground and the ground operators, they'll have some requirement to send commands to the vehicle, analyze telemetry on the ground, and in the case of an anomaly, respond to that anomaly. And how are you documenting what you do so that if the same anomaly happens in 2 weeks, that person or a different person on console can respond in the same way? And so we're helping operators on the ground document all of their operations, make sure that if you have repeatable operations, they're always being done in the same way so that you don't put any part of your vehicle in danger.
How do you manage the balance between automation and efficiency and accuracy and sort of thoroughness of these checks, which sounds so critical?
Generally, what I try to recommend is as you build your vehicle and operations, you are thinking about what automation you want in both places. And as you build out your operational protocols and procedures on the ground, you build out the manual steps first, and then you test those out on the ground. And then if you can and need to automate them, want to have the time, you automate them on the spacecraft, but you still have the ground checks. so that you can follow along with the spacecraft, because it's usually an iterative process. It's not just build automation and everybody's hands off. You have to do it in a sort of step function, especially if it's a new vehicle, if it's a first time. And then as you learn more about how your vehicle operates in space, you might learn that there are a couple more things you want to automate. And then you can upload new flight software, change your ground processes to monitor instead of send commands, and so on and so forth.
With this huge inbound of data that you're getting access to, it seems like a natural training ground for today's large language models and AI. No doubt your industry is looking at it and you're looking at it with keen interest. How are you starting to take advantage of these models?
Yeah, I think this is a touchy subject, mostly because as we store more data for our customers, we have to be very sensitive about the models that we're using and who has access to those models, mostly because of security and ITAR. And so we want to be very cognizant of how we give our users access to AI, machine learning models. I mean, there are sort of endless use cases that I can think of. So, obviously there's the model where you're collecting a lot of data and you're able to predict things that may happen on your vehicle based on previous data collected. So that predictive notification, and then with something like Epsilon 3 being able to predict what might happen and potentially even recover from an anomaly before it happens. So let's say radiation hit on one of your flight computers. Let's say there's always a signal 20 minutes before that radiation hit happens. And every time it happens, you're out of commission for your satellite for 5 minutes. Well, let's say if you know about it and you reboot the flight computer before that happens and it doesn't happen, you could have some predictive maintenance happen and then you're not out of commission ever. So your data is pretty steady the entire time and you have access to payload data the entire time. It changes the ability and the uptime you have, which actually makes you more profitable in the end. But that's kind of one thing I've been thinking about. The other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how we operate on the ground and how much time we spend doing things. So kind of analyzing the data on the human aspect. So how much time am I spending doing a specific task? And how can I train myself to be better? And how can I be told where to look, what to do in the application by the application itself? So that's something else I've been thinking a lot about.
And is that starting to mimic a kind of an AI co-pilot for, these kind of expert industries? It feels there's so much knowledge to be consumed by these experts within these very technical industries, both tribal knowledge and, industry knowledge. Do you foresee the potential for an AI co-pilot to help them along their day?
I think there's definitely an aspect of that. The thing on the potential co-pilot is as you're composing documentation, as you're looking at improving documentation, procedures, tests, etc., that co-pilot can suggest certain things that may be better suited to your vehicle. So let's say you upload all of the concept of operations documentation, all of the requirements. Maybe you train your model on what your vehicle is capable of, and the co-pilot, as you say, might be able to provide suggestions as to what you could do better. I'm just hoping that each company doesn't have to have its own control room and its own set of 5 to 20 operators, so that we can get all of those brilliant minds working on building new innovative hardware rather than operating in space. You won't see 50 people in a control room for one launch. You won't see a control room with even 5 people, hopefully. And if there's 5 people, maybe they're controlling 50 different assets that are very complex and a couple hundred assets that are mostly operating on their own. That's my hope for space. And then when you get to space station operations, hoping that there are also small teams working on private space station operations and working with the crew that might be living in space. That is what I see and is my hope for the future of space operations.
I love that. So the organization shifts from probably equal sets operators and innovators and builders to a much more automated area that does the operations and much more emphasis on the innovation and the other parts of the business from there.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And look, we've talked a lot about the space industry and like, who can blame us? It's so cool. So, and exciting. So thanks for that. But that's just one vertical for Epsilon, because really at your core, it's around how you deliver value to, complex industries of all sorts. And just picking out three that you also serve: robotics, energy, and defense. Like, what are the common opportunities for transformation across these organizations?
I really want alternative energy sources to help power all of the amazing things that we can do on this planet. But we have to do it safely. If you look at nuclear fusion, there are a lot of ways that it can go wrong, and it is a very complex operation. Very similarly to a launch or spacecraft operation, you can't always go and manipulate manually. So you have to be confident in your vehicle as in quotations here, but your system, and you have to be able to control it in the safest possible way. So that, I think, is very similar to how we run launch operations. And then, with defense, it's not necessarily just defense, it's aviation. So in eVTOLs and hypersonics, supersonics, I think there's going to be a lot of growth in those areas in the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm really excited to be able to travel cross country in a very short amount of time, or travel to a different country in an hour or two. I want to help make that a possibility. And then in robotics, I think the same, underwater exploration. We haven't touched on it yet, but as much as we haven't explored space, we haven't explored our own planet completely yet. There's a lot yet to explore under the ocean. And I think robotics can help us get there. So we support, obviously, an underwater robotics company, and hoping that more pop up and we can continue to explore our own planet as well.
Yeah, and I can imagine that's quite similar to sending something up into space as going to the depth of the ocean in one of those vehicles too. Let's bring back to the supersonic aerospace travels. What are you seeing in that industry, and how is it borrowing perhaps from areas like the space industry to push it forward?
You're seeing a lot of talent go to those types of companies. And so you're seeing a lot of the processes by which we developed, tested, and built and flew our launch vehicles and, space capsules going to build the next generation of aircraft that will hopefully get us places a lot faster. So I think in that way, that industry is being shaped in part by what we did to innovate on the space industry. So I think that's pretty cool.
That's great. And you really hear about this talent being the big unlock for people. It's the talent going from a SpaceX to a private company, or, the proliferation of these people who've learned within these organizations that has been the big unlock for the industry. And like you're saying, now going into aerospace. So how important is that flow of talent? And are you just seeing a huge amount of increase in people joining the industry and moving around?
I think because of the success of SpaceX, people look at the space industry different than they did in the past. And you're seeing talent want to go there. You're seeing people who want to think outside of the box, who want to do things differently than they've been done before, go to an industry like space to be able to make a big impact. And I think now, knowing what I know now that I didn't know 15 years ago, that was what I wanted. I wanted to make an impact. I wanted to see change in the industry. And I was willing to, get paid less or, work really long hours to help be part of that change. And I'm excited that more young people want to do that as well. And I think you're right. It is an unlock, but it's not just the people, it's the experiences that they get at startups. It's the ability to think outside of the box. It's the ability to solve problems. It's the ability to see the bigger picture and do things differently, challenge yourself. It's kind of all of those things together. And I think the space industry is just one place where that has been prevalent. And there's a lot of other sort of slightly tangential industries that it's also kind of bled into, which is really cool.
It's also coalescing around different regions. You know, people think about technology innovation. I think of Silicon Valley, of New York, where a lot of these startups start to coalesce naturally. But for areas like space, defense, and robotics, we're starting to see these new hubs kind of emerge, like El Segundo, or sort of in the area where you are in California, and then others around Texas. Yeah. Can you speak to a little bit about like how these new communities and areas are forming, and sort of which ones will start to play a bigger role going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think California, like you mentioned, specifically Southern California, has been a space hub for a long time, but not necessarily a startup hub. So, you know, before I joined this industry, and I think, you know, obviously before I was even born, companies like TRW and Hughes Aircraft were starting in this area, in Redondo Beach, in El Segundo, and other places around here, probably because of the talent. It's close to a lot of universities, and it's also, you know, back then they had the space, which they don't have now, but they're already here. So they don't necessarily move. And so now you have companies that like TRW, who merged with Northrop, Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing, Aerospace Corporation, and LA Air Force Base, all in El Segundo, Los Angeles area. And after SpaceX started in 2002, you now have the ability for those people to go to a startup just down the street. And now you have a startup mentality being basically born in this area. And those people leaving SpaceX potentially 5-10 years later to go start something new. You have Colorado, which has always been a space hub. There's a lot of military presence in Colorado. You know, large companies like Northrop, Lockheed, Ball Aerospace, they all have a huge presence in Colorado. So I think those are kind of two hubs. Obviously, NASA with Johnson Space Center in Houston. There's a lot starting in and out around that area. You've got Axiom, you've got Venus, you've got a lot going on in the Houston area. And then you'll also see a lot in Florida. That's kind of natural with the Space Coast. And then you've got Virginia. And I think those are kind of the biggest space hubs.
Wow. No shortage of places. And I love how none of them are the typical places that you're seeing the rest of the software innovation happen from there. Are you seeing then, or do you foresee an increasing sort of interconnection with some of the traditional hubs in software to start to enable them to serve the space industry? Or do you feel like you really have to create something purpose-built for these kind of complex industries when it comes to software?
Well, because of security, because of privacy, data, traditional software companies probably are not going to be as interested in this because they've already established potentially a stronghold in something like finance. And so looking at completely pivoting some of their security practices, some of their, deployment practices into serving a completely different customer set is probably not where they want to be. So probably it has to be born out of the space industry or automotive industry. It can't just be typical software.
No, Laura, thanks so much for coming on today and to share that. I'd be remiss to not ask one last question around the rise of space tourism and travel. How much has the interplanetary mindset of wanting Earth to be an interplanetary community infiltrated down into the rest of the space industry? Or is that something just very localized around people like Elon?
I think everybody has an idea of where they would want to go and what they would want to do in space. I think as a species, we are explorers. We want to know what's out there. I think we have to know how to get to Mars, and we have to know how to live there. Do I think that half of our planet is going to live there? probably not, at least not in my lifetime. But I think it will help us understand how we take care of our own planet better. And I think that's one of the biggest things we can get out of our travel to space and our understanding of humanity and what we're capable of and how we take care of ourselves, the Earth, potentially Mars in the future. And that's really what I want to see people get out of this. I do think that living in space and potential to have people living on Mars would be a good thing for us to kind of bring other technologies back, take technology there to help us better serve ourselves in multiple locations.
I just think it's a really awesome to have a stretch goal sometimes that just pushes everyone forward. Because if you're trying to get people to Mars, it feels like getting someone back on the moon is just a smaller task from there. But yeah, agree with the concept of sort of the learnings that could be applied back on Earth as well. Is there a upcoming mission that's getting you excited that's on the roadmap for the industry?
Well, launching today in approximately 4 hours is the Starliner crew. I know both of the astronauts that are flying on that, so it's of particular importance to me. And then the Polaris Dawn crew, I know multiple people flying on that mission. And so
where are they going?
I think both of those will be they're going above the ISS, so they're going to a higher orbit than the space station. And then obviously the Artemis crew going to the moon will be really amazing. I personally want to see people walk on the moon again, so I'm very excited about that.
Totally there with you, Laura. Let's get astronauts back on the moon, get in those suits, bouncing about in zero gravity for all the world to see again. It would be incredible inspiration. And thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. And speaking of inspiration, your whole industry, all the work you guys are doing is an inspiration to the rest of us. So thanks for all the hard work that you put in. And we're super excited about watching this industry evolve and develop and watching you and Epsilon 3 pioneer a lot of the innovation along the way. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Who doesn't enjoy talking about space? The industry is rapidly privatizing, innovating, and attracting top talent. Laura's a case in point, having gone from Northrop, a traditional aerospace company, to Spacex, to now launching her own advanced software startup for the space industry. I loved hearing about the new deep tech hubs that present a hive of activity like El Segundo. There are so many moving pieces to this puzzle to put together in this complex industry and room for continuous innovation. And you can see the potential for advances in the space industry to flow through to the rest of the innovation economy and vice versa to create a flywheel of progress. To find Laura and to follow her mission, you can find her on Twitter at LLCrabby. That's CRABBIE. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and please subscribe to the podcast to listen to more coming down the pipe. Until next time, thanks for listening and have a great rest of your day.